And now we finally come to our concluding chapter. In this chapter, we will revisit some of what we have learned and reflect a bit farther on some key issues we have discussed in past chapters. We begin with a look at the three-generation process that immigrant groups are said to undergo as they assimilate into the mainstream culture. Our authors tell us that process of assimilation is impacted by historical factors and the level of discrimination a group faces as they go through the process. We are told that because of this, few American groups have reached full assimilation in the three generations as expected. A form of symbolic ethnicity persists which give individuals a sense of belonging and identity. With this in mind, our authors now take us back to reflect a bit on some groups we have discussed. They tell us that even the colonial immigrants actually might have taken 6 to 8 generations to fully assimilate to the point where they are now. Irish and German immigrants of the first stream are more distinguishable among the mainstream, but are expected to move to higher levels of Anglo-conformity with time. They also tell us that the symbolic ethnicity we spoke of earlier might lead to further revival of some ethnic groups. Second stream Italians, with their initial adherence to their family and community values, didn't appear to be ready to move towards assimilation at first. Now they closely resemble the typical white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, which tells us that among all white ethnic groups there is a gradual fading of their cultural distinctiveness. Irish immigrants are cited as an example. Their status was low upon their arrival, yet they distanced themselves from blacks. They joined white labor unions, and their political activity reflected their desire to identify with whites and their values. Eventually, they became part of the oppressing white race in America. The term white and what it means to be white changed over the years. Whiteness is something that is socially negotiated and not necessarily determined by nature. You might remember the case of Ozawa versus the United States, where the Supreme Court ruled that skin color was not the determining factor. The color of your skin might make you Caucasian, but not necessarily white. Because we are a nation whose core culture focuses on white norms and values, white people are unlikely to think of themselves as white. If you were to ask a random white individual what their ethnicity is, they are very unlikely to say that they're white, and more likely to respond with their ancestral origins and say German or Italian. They subscribe to racist ideas and may even behave in subtly racist ways, such as using ethnic slurs or sharing ethnic jokes. They may also have benefited economically from belonging to the group. Our authors refer to this as laissez-faire racism. With mixed marriages now so common, many people have several ethnic groups as ancestors, and they identify themselves as multi-ethnic. Now, coming back to the three-generation model. While 3 generations can be enough time for a group to achieve a high degree of cultural and secondary assimilation, the remaining forms of assimilation can take somewhat longer. If we assume that second-stream immigrants are moving towards a full merger with the mainstream Anglo culture, then there should be a gradual blending that occurs in making them less distinctive. Apparently, pluralist ideas have persisted since many groups have retained elements of their cultures over time or have renewed their interest in their ancestry. The expectation that ethnic identity should vanish completely doesn't consider the dynamics of intergroup relations. Now we take some time to reflect on the experiences of non-white groups. We have seen that initial relations between a dominant group and a colonized group do not generally lead to the expected 3-generation pattern for assimilation and conformity. Both groups involved might resist the full merger in a variety of ways, such as establishing a separate nation, overthrowing the dominant group, or just by leaving the territory. With this in mind, let us consider blacks outside of the Deep South who have not yet been where they are now for more than 3 generations. While they have faced more discrimination than previous immigrant generations, their future experiences may resemble those of white ethnics. This does not deny the validity of the colonial model as it relates to the experiences of some non-whites in America who may have endured or experienced various circumstances such as slavery, conquest, or relocation. As we reconsider the consequences of colonization and immigration, our authors now offer us an alternate view. They tell us that both models are essentially correct. This view focuses on the social characteristics of colonized and immigrant groups as they began their formation. It also considers the probability of some of the generalizations made about immigrant and colonized groups as compared to the certainties of each group, and that the assimilation processes will include a dynamic merger of elements found in both the immigrant and colonial models. A colonized group that was once an independent society may maintain mostly political relationships to the dominant group. They may remain steadfast to their familiar relationships. They may also remain able to function economically as they did before within the host society if allowed. Immigrant groups, on the other hand, are completely dependent on the host society for all of their needs. They are also less likely than a colonized group to be resentful of the host society and may desire equal treatment. Colonized groups are usually complete social units from the very start of colonization. Their main concern after being conquered is to remain intact as a social unit. The relationship to the conquering society is likely to be adversarial and fraught with resistance to assimilation. Our authors refer to this as a centrifugal relationship. Their tendency is to gravitate away from the mainstream. Immigrant ethnic groups, on the other hand, usually come together within the mainstream society and must rely on whatever social institutions they find there. Dominant and subordinate groups are usually concerned with finding mutual satisfactory ways to bring the groups together. The relationship of the immigrant minority to the host society is likely to be less adversarial, with some resistance to certain aspects of assimilation as they seek secondary assimilation. We refer to this as a centripetal relationship, where the tendency of the minority is to gravitate in the direction of the host society. While a centrifugal relationship may occur via immigration and a centripetal relationship through conquest, it is important to know whether a group has entered a society by conquest or immigration, as it gives insight to the type of relationship that probably came about between a minority group and a majority group. The result of contact, rather than how it came about, has the greatest effect on how the groups will get on. We might think the lines drawn between groups are fixed and stable, but they are not. The importance of such boundaries may change depending on various factors. The vitality of ethnic identity is influenced by context. The way groups view each other may change depending on the situation. Ethnogenesis can bring about new identities that bring groups together. Identities such as Asian, Hispanic, Latino, or American Indian are pan-ethnic identities. This alternative view of long-range outcomes of contact between dominant and subordinate groups is more dynamic than the view of either the colonial or immigrant models. What are some implications of this alternative view where both models, the colonial and the immigrant, are mostly correct? Our authors explain that the issue of conquest is not as crucial as the fact that when Mexicans and Puerto Ricans were conquered, they already had well-developed social institutions. This enabled them to take a different path where assimilation is concerned, due to their ability to support each other and maintain their cultural integrity. Their relationship with the Anglo-American society was centrifugal due to their ability to support themselves. The recent influx of Puerto Ricans and Mexicans to the United States meant that the relationship was changing to a centripetal one. The assimilationist goals of both of these groups are impacted by the proximity of their mother country and the discrimination they face in the U.S., along with political issues that remain. These may cause Puerto Ricans and Mexican Americans to give up on assimilation altogether. Their upward mobility within our society may enable them to maintain elements of their culture while participating fully in our society. Native Americans also came into the society via conquest. They provide clear examples of centrifugal relationships. Since becoming citizens in 1924, they have shown signs of banding together and becoming one ethnic group with a centripetal relationship to the mainstream. They don't embrace the idea of Anglo-conformity. They are mixed about secondary assimilation, and they continue to resist all efforts to terminate their treaty rights. Native Americans continue to struggle toward the goal of assimilation while maintaining the right to live as Indians. African Americans and the dominant group have always maintained a centrifugal relationship. They were always dependent on the host society. Hindered by slavery, they were not able to form an inclusive ethnic group. They have been able to build their own institutions in the U.S. slowly and with great effort. They have been divided between cultural pluralism and Anglo-conformity and sometimes separatism. Many successful African Americans continue to feel it is impossible to be truly accepted in America. The growth of non-white voluntary immigration to the United States since 1965 from many nations challenges the ethnic pattern of assimilation of immigrants from Europe. Second-generation Black immigrants must decide between identifying with Black Americans or keeping an ancestral ethnic identity. They face many social and political pressures to identify only as Blacks. The disappearance of intermediate job opportunities in the U.S. has decreased the opportunities for upward mobility that existed before, causing a segmentation of the process of assimilation. Rather than being assimilated into the mainstream, white middle-class society, new immigrants may find themselves being assimilated into permanent poverty or may deliberately remain within the immigrant community. Our text now outlines some conclusions for us to consider. The basic faith of the cultural pluralists is that we can agree with many of the principles of American economic and political life without complete capitulation to the dominant group. There is considerable debate among whites concerning cultural pluralism. Anglo-conformity is greater among WASPs, while the pluralism is greater among white descendants of second immigration. It is the desire to improve their lot in life that motivates assimilation among all groups. In today's more diverse society, assimilation will take many forms without requiring the extinction of ethnic differences. There is certainly some support within both white and non-white groups for separatism, the strongest coming from the whites. During the 1990s, white separatist propaganda was widespread and often called for an Aryan homeland. Although cultural pluralism rejects full Anglo-conformity, it is best understood as a form of assimilation that is gaining ground within American society. So now we need to consider what will become of ethnicity in our country. Anglo-conformists and cultural pluralists differ in some notable ways, but their differences center around the existing economic and political framework, which both sides accept. While history shows that official discrimination has been common against many groups, especially non-white groups, our legal system has shown that these acts run against our country's basic principles. We have also seen that our institutions are flexible enough to allow intergroup acceptance to continue. Although many groups have achieved a high degree of cultural and secondary assimilation within 3 generations, third and later generations have displayed a renewed interest in revitalizing their ethnic heritages. The continued existence of racial and ethnic minority groups may sometimes pose challenges where national unity is concerned, but they do help give a sense of individuality and social purpose for many Americans. The greatest problem with maintaining high levels of social cultural distinctiveness is that we fail to provide equal opportunities for secondary assimilation to every American who desires them. We need to find ways to increase opportunities for individuals to leave the ethnic community or remain within it according to their wishes. This can only be done by addressing the existing levels of racism. In other parts of the world, Sweden has no history of colonialism or interracial conflict and has a strong political commitment to create an equitable society. They are currently struggling with assimilation of newcomers, initially embracing the idea of Swedish conformity and then striking a path toward pluralism. Global economic restructuring and the ensuing economic issues led to high rates of unemployment and heightened tensions between local and foreign populations. Sound familiar? In South Africa, the demise of apartheid led to control of the government by the black majority. The shift in power from the white minority to the black majority is a challenge to the survival of South Africa as a multiracial society. The country must redress previous inequality in education, healthcare, and job opportunities. They are also struggling with tensions caused by undocumented immigrants from neighboring countries. Both blacks and whites are exhibiting an increasing xenophobia. Canada has struggled since the 1960s with a strong secessionist movement on the part of the French-speaking province of Quebec, showing the strong sense of ethnic identity that is tied to language. They have their immigration issues as well. They allow about 200,000 legal immigrants a year, but have had to tighten their policies on undocumented immigrants and refugees. Brazil, like the U.S., also has a history of slavery, but they had more intermarriage between whites and blacks, and they never separated their races as we did with Jim Crow. Although some would argue that Brazil has few racial conflicts, blacks and mulattoes in Brazil have fewer opportunities than whites and encounter many forms of discrimination. Brazil's experiences demonstrate that the blending of racial groups through intermarriage does not in itself solve all of the racial problems. Kosovo provides a clear illustration of how ethnic inclusion can fail. Competition and conflict led to polarization of the groups into an them and us scenario. In 1989, the Serbs began attacking Albanians. Serbs expelled Albanian professionals from the state institutions, destroyed Albanian villages, and drove hundreds of thousands of Albanians from their countries as refugees. NATO troops bombed suspected Serbian military locations and ended the violence, allowing the Albanian refugees to return to their homes. However, the violence continued between the groups with ethnic hatred on both sides. These examples demonstrate the complexity of racial and ethnic relations around the world. The members of each new generation must learn again how to recognize the irrationality of stereotypes and racism. Maintaining pluralism means that members of all groups must take action against tolerance.